Welcome to the Lutheran History Podcast. Today's episode is a special tribute episode, and we'll cover the history of Lutheranism in Alaska. This is based off a previous presentation I had given at several locations for various reasons a few years ago. I'm deciding to give this as a podcast episode today as a tribute to my time as a pastor here in Alaska for almost 5 years now. If you had listened to our last episode, you probably caught the note that my wife Molly and I have accepted our calls to serve a new congregation in Marathon, Wisconsin, or I should say it's new to us. With this, I want to take the opportunity to reflect upon not only my time here in Alaska, but also the history of Lutheranism in this rather special 49th state of the United States. Some of the things today you may hear will surprise you. Well, this episode follows the pattern of other episodes where I have gone through some personal research and simply presented it. This episode is a little different because it is not so much done out of primary research, although it does reflect that, but it is more the synthesis of some of the interesting aspects of history of Lutheranism in Alaska. Now, this is based off a PowerPoint presentation I had made, as I had noted several years ago. Therefore, there are a lot of rich visual aids, and you will probably get a little bit more out of it if you watch it in video form. Now, normally I give a YouTube video for every podcast that I do, but only those who are at a certain tier on Patreon get to see these videos. But as a special treat for everyone, I am going to release this video as well on YouTube. You'll be hearing exactly word for word what I am saying right now, along with the slides where you can see more of the visuals. You can go to the Lutheran History channel on YouTube, subscribe, and watch the videos there. You'll just be listening to this again in this form if you switch right now. With that being said, I'd like to get into the history of Lutheranism in Alaska. As it turns out, the year 2017, the year before I arrived here in Alaska, was a rather important year for anniversaries. As most Lutherans know, 2017 was well celebrated and commemorated as the 500th anniversary of the Lutheran Reformation. However, in Alaska, 2017 was also another rather special anniversary, which was noted in some circles. It was the 150th anniversary of the purchase of Alaska by the United States from the Russian Empire, which took place in 1867. At the 100th anniversary, a small group of Lutherans decided to put together a little history book concerning and covering the history of Lutheranism in the state and the previous territory of Alaska. As one editor noted, "As Lutherans, we are proud to have a part in the history of Alaska and to have been along the spiritual, moral, and ethical contributions that the Christian churches have made in her development." End quote. Now, it is interesting to note that in 1867, there weren't really many Lutherans at all in Alaska, but its history goes back more than a century before that time. In the year 1967, there were 4 mainline Protestant Lutheran denominations represented in Alaska, the Missouri Synod being one of them, and the other 3 being the church bodies that would form what is today the ELCA. As we'll see later in this episode, the Wisconsin Synod would make its presence known just a few years later. Which we will consider for today is, what form did Lutheranism take in the earliest stages of Alaska's development during its period of Russian Orthodoxy? In fact, Lutheranism was the only recognized and permitted religion apart from Russian Orthodoxy in Alaska during the Russian period. However, we will see that it was not exactly embraced by the higher-ups in the system. Now, normally the pattern of the history of Lutheranism and its spread throughout the United States and North America follows a pattern of Eastern development heading west. This is the development that most U.S. histories cover. Colonialization on the East Coast, eventual establishment of the independent United States, and the westward expansion that took place throughout most of the 1800s. However, with Alaska, the story is the exact opposite. The Russian explorers first arrived in the 1700s on the west coast of Alaska, and then headed east. This was following the development of several centuries of Russian expansion through Siberia eastward towards the Pacific Ocean. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the Russian Empire had expanded largely at the expense of Lutheran empires, in particular the Empire of Sweden, really the Swedish kingdom. But back in the 1600s and early 1700s, Sweden was a large empire, encompassing most of the Baltic Sea territories, including areas in Lutheran northern Germany. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, also saw the immigration of German Lutheran populations into Russia, establishing their own subculture within that empire. In 1741, Vitus Bering, who you may have heard of simply through the term the Bering Sea, a major geographical feature of the Alaskan geography, he was the one who first led the official Russian exploratory mission in the Pacific Ocean, which would eventually discover parts of Alaska. Vitus Bering was not an Orthodox Russian, but instead a Lutheran Dane working in the Russian service. Vitus Bering did not survive his exploratory mission. One of the fellow Lutherans along on that journey, which we'll hear about in just a second, noted in his diary that Vitus Bering was buried, quote, according to the custom of our church. You might say the first Christian Alaskan funeral was a Lutheran one. The man who noted this was Georg Wilhelm Steller. He was the son of a Lutheran cantor, and he had studied theology at the Wittenberg University of Reformation fame, before he switched his career tracks and studied medicine in the Pietist-influenced Halle, two Lutheran universities, if you've ever heard of one. He was the scientist, the educated gentleman who accompanied Bering, and he made several scientific contributions. Alaskans will recognize terms like stellar seal or a stellar jay. There's even a stellar sea manatee. And I don't know if he named all these things after himself or because he was the first one to record them and share them with the broader Western world. Others simply named these things after him. But he, of course, was another Lutheran influence that is still seen today in Alaska, if only through his name. In the year 1799, the Russian-American Company was founded by the Tsar Paul I. This is similar to the Hudson Bay Company or the East India Company. It was a government-connected business that meant to exploit the natural resources of this new colony of Russian America, in other words, Alaska. In the year 1823, it's noted that the Finnish population made up over 20% of this company. The Finns also were traditionally a region that was inhabited and pretty much influenced thoroughly by Lutheranism. So not to say that every single Finnish person who stepped foot on Alaska was a pious and active Lutheran, but that was certainly the religious background which he would have carried with him. It also turns out that many of the governors of Russian America, today known as Alaska, were Lutheran, partially because they were from this German or Finnish population that formed part of the Russian Empire. The first one was Ferdinand von Wrangel, who was governor of Alaska from 1830 to 1835. This is, as far as we know, more of a cultural Lutheranism, as he did not have much interaction with Lutheranism, or at least as it is noted in the history of Alaska. His faith was not a big part of what is remembered. However, the second Lutheran governor of Alaska, which is in a Finnish name, so forgive my pronunciation, his name was Arvid Adolf Eetola. He served as governor from 1838 to 1845. The third Lutheran governor, one of the last governors of Russian America, was Johann Hampus Fruuhjelm. Again, a Finnish pronunciation, not sure if I got that right. But these latter two governors certainly had much more interaction with their Lutheran faith in Alaska. The first Lutheran church founded in Alaska was in Sitka, at that time known as New Archangel, the capital or the headquarters of the Russian American Company, or then later on the official government control over Russian America, moved from west to east. First in Dutch, what is today known as Dutch Harbor, and the Aleutian Islands, it moved to Kodiak and Kodiak Island, and then it moved to its farther and easternmost place in New Archangel, or Sitka, on Baranof Island, one of the major regions of the inner channel, the inner passage of the islands, the southeastern part of Alaska. The Sitka Lutheran Church was organized at Margareta Etolin's insistence. She was the wife of that second Russian Lutheran governor I had just mentioned. She personally recruited Pastor Uno Signaeus, again a name I'm not confident on pronouncing. He was a man who was well-rounded. He had studied zoology, medicine, and theology. Together, the Etolins and Signaeus sailed from Helsinki as the governor's party to Sitka on the ship named the Nikolai. During this long voyage, Signaeus performed a wedding and baptized the governor's child. Now, according to some, and I have not confirmed this, it is asserted that the Lutheran Church in Sitka was the first ever Protestant church of any kind established on the entire Pacific coast of North or South America. That's quite a bit of trivia, if you can believe it. This congregation was founded in the year 1839. As part of the Wisconsin Synod, I'm familiar with the history of Lutheranism in Wisconsin. And for most people, we think that we've been around for quite a long time. But it turns out the very first Lutheran congregation formed in the state of Wisconsin in the Midwest during this period of German and other Lutheran immigrants was also in the year 1839. So long story short, the history of Lutheranism in Alaska is just as old as many areas of the upper Midwest. Now, Uno Signaeus, this pastor, served a large mix of Lutherans. Some of them were Finnish, Swedish, or Germans, but all of them were working for, or at least connected to, the Russian-American Company. Now, this was a period of Russian authoritarianism. Of course, the czars always had some kind of absolute control, but they waxed and waned as far as they wanted to control literally everything. But as is still seen today, with the current conflict with Russia, the sense of identity of being Russian and being Russian Orthodox were meant to be tied hand in hand. The bishop, Johann Veniaminov, again, my pronunciation is tricky, the bishop of Russian America forbade Signaeus to do any kind of mission work, to evangelize anyone. In other words, Signaeus could only serve the needs of people who already were Lutheran. He could not possibly try to convert anyone else, especially someone who's supposed to be Orthodox, to the Lutheran faith. Russia at this time had this trifecta of policies: orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. Finnish Lutheranism did not fit those molds at all. Signaeus held his first service, at least publicly, on August 23rd, the year 1840, in the governor's palace. His sermons, apparently many of which still survive, were often focused on the themes of justification and sanctification. He also focused on adult catechesis, despite obstacles of illiteracy among many of the workers for the Russian American Company. Although he had one church, and there was only ever one Lutheran congregation established in Russian America, Signaeus made long-distance trips to visit Finnish Lutheran populations or other kinds of Lutherans throughout Russian America. He sailed to Kodiak Island, to the Aleutians, and even the Kurils in what is today Eastern Asia. The Sitka Lutheran Church saw its membership rise from 90 members in 1840 to 203 in 1844. Initial plans to build a church building were blocked by Bishop Innocent. However, in the year 1843, there was allowance to build a church, a site of worship, near St. Michael's Orthodox Cathedral in Sitka. There are some images available of New Archangel or Sitka where you can see the church. However, it's very difficult to spot because they were forbidden to put a steeple or any kind of religious features on the outside to mark it as a church. It simply looks like a two-story building right outside the Russian Orthodox Cathedral. Lutheranism's presence was meant to be hidden and rather discreet. The original altarpiece, the painting that stood behind the altar, is still available to be seen. Although it was a rather modest building, it was richly decorated on the inside, and it still contains Alaska's oldest organ. And I should say the current Sitka congregation that claims lineage to this congregation has it. The original structure, unfortunately, is no longer standing. In the year 1845, Pastor Signaeus, as well as the Lutheran governors, the Etolins, left Sitka. However, two more Lutheran pastors would serve in this period of Russian America Lutheranism. The first successor was Gabriel Platem. Rather than sailing on a ship from Helsinki, he traveled 9 months on land from Finland through Siberia to Alaska in the year 1845. It took, obviously, most of that year just to get to Alaska. Gabriel Platem is remembered for struggling as a preacher, especially in the German language. Remember, they had at least 3 distinct language groups, possibly more, that he had to serve if he was serving the Lutheran population. Gabriel Platem also suffered because, unlike Signaeus, he did not have a Lutheran governor right down the street to support him in his endeavors. Yet he still made trips to Lutherans in the various outposts in the vast lands of Russian America. Platem left Alaska in 1853, after 8 years of service. The final Lutheran pastor during the Russian American period is Georg Gustav Winter. He also had studied in Helsinki, and he arrived in Sitka in the year 1853, showing that there was more or less complete continuity for this brief Lutheran period in Russian America. His congregation, however, had unstable and seasonal membership. As anyone who has lived in Alaska knows, the seasons are quick and intense, and your whole life is adjusted around the seasons, especially for those working in the collection of furs, as the Russian American company was often preoccupied with. So his membership would radically alter from week to week, especially month to month. However, Winter did enjoy the friendship and support of the third Lutheran governor of Alaska, Governor Fruhuyel. He also delivered the funeral sermon for a later governor's wife, Princess Maksutov. Again, Russian pronunciation is difficult. He left Alaska in the year 1865, just 2 years short of the time when America, the United States, would purchase Alaska. So what happened to Russian America's last Lutherans? Turns out they were more or less a shepherdless flock. For various reasons, Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1867. There was already a 2-year vacancy in Sitka by that time, and now that the United States controlled the territory, it would not be filled from Finland. A Methodist preacher was allowed to use the Lutheran church structure during the early American period. Many inhabitants in Russian America, including the Lutheran population, chose to leave rather than to become U.S. citizens. In a rather divisive vote, the congregation decided to sell the church's movable property or to even send it all the way back to Europe. The original structure was torn down in the year 18. That ends our section on the history of Lutheranism in Russian America. The next question we will ask is, how was Lutheranism reestablished in the territory and later the state of Alaska? Anyone who has studied Lutheran history in America knows there's quite a wide variety of Lutheran synods and groups, some in fellowship, some outside of fellowship, some merge and some split. It's still difficult today to even get a handle on all the ones that currently exist, much less to track the history of all these synods throughout Lutheranism's long history in the United States. But I have listed here the different Lutheran denominations that have had a presence in Alaska. We already noted the Lutheran Church of Finland officially had its presence in Russian America. The Lutheran Church of Sweden also sent missionaries during this later American period. In the past, you saw the Augustana Evangelical Lutheran Church, the Norwegian and Evangelical Lutheran Churches, the American Lutheran Church, the Lutheran Church in America, and Lutheran Mission Societies Incorporated. Today, we still have 5 different Lutheran groups having some kind of presence in Alaska. We have the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Church of the Lutheran Confession, and the Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America. The first who came to take over, or at least to reestablish Lutheranism in Alaska while it was still a territory, was the Swedish Lutheran Church. The Church of Sweden officially had 10 missionaries in Alaska in the 1890s, and if you know your rough outline of Alaskan or at least American history, this is kind of the time of those later gold rushes of the Yukon and others. In the year 1896, Pastor Samuel Immonen, who also happened to be Finnish, but he was from Michigan. He visited Sitka, Douglas, and Juneau. and he noted there were many Scandinavian immigrants. In fact, if you go around my area, the Kenai Peninsula, you'll find some of the earliest cabins, which are still standing from the 1890s or early 1900s, are owned by Scandinavians. Apparently, the climate did not faze them at all, and they found many ways to make a living. Yet, an established church was not something that came about for various reasons. But in 1896, this pastor started to get the ground running. In the year 1900, the Augustana Synod, which is a former Swedish immigrant church group in America, they decided to send a Pastor Lindahl to Alaska to assess the needs of the people here. They also later sent Pastor Holmberg, and he spent 9 months toiling in Douglas. Holmberg rented a hall in which he held services every other Sunday, as well as every other Sunday afternoon, in the evenings and afternoon. He noted the squalid conditions and the desperate need for religious leadership. Holmberg warned his board that if they did not provide Douglas with a permanent missionary, the Swedish and American Methodist churches would take all the people. So a Swedish lay pastor from Seattle, Johann Levin, was assigned and ordained by the Augustana Synod. Already 63 years old, he raised money for and then personally helped build the church structure. He served Lutheran Swedes, Finns, Norwegians, Danes, Germans, and those who considered themselves to be nothing more than Americans. In 1907, another pastor came to replace Levin. This pastor, named Varmanen, attempted to organize separate congregations based on linguistic lines just to keep things straight, but the transient population patterns hindered his efforts. This will be a pattern that still exists to this day, from the days of Signaeus and his seasonal workers in Russian America, to the seasonal work of gold mining and fishing and other things that Varmanen noted. And even till today, people are transient. They come and go from Alaska quite often. They move about, and the seasons greatly affect their lives and patterns. In the year 1917, the Treadwell mine disaster created such a mass exodus that the Augustana Synod's parish had lost the majority of its membership, and the congregation sadly collapsed. On almost the opposite end of what is today the state of Alaska, another mission opportunity took place. Between the year 1892 and 1900, the U.S. government operated the Teller Reindeer Station, 65 miles northwest of Nome, Alaska. The government decided to hire Lapps, a minority ethnic group who are experts with reindeer, originally from Norway. They wanted to train the local native population how to profitably use and run a reindeer farm. The Norwegian Lutheran synods, Reverend Toluf Brevig, began serving the reindeer station because the Lapps would have been Lutheran already. On August 1st, 1894, he served as their pastor and teacher, but also missionary to the Eskimos, also known as the Inupiaq. Pastor Brevig traveled between villages by dog team along the beach and often performed services in Nome. If you've ever watched the movie Balto or one of the other movies like that, you kind of get a feel for the area where he was in. A Lutheran mission was constructed at the present site in 1900, and the village became known as Teller Mission. The mission was given 100 reindeer and a 5-year loan from the government. Already by the year 1906, the government's role had largely diminished, and the mission itself became the dominant central feature of the settlement. Julie Brevig, the wife of Pastor Brevig, established the Teller Orphanage, where she worked as a nurse and a teacher. Born in 1896, Dagny Alaska Brevig was the first American Lutheran born in Alaska, at least according to some. She was described by having an old head on young shoulders. Her knowledge of the Inuit language allowed her to translate Bible truths in a way that the Inuit could understand, being bilingual or maybe even trilingual as she grew up among the local people. Sadly, Julie Brevig and 2 children died and were buried at that mission during a pandemic. She, quote, rests in the land of the people whom she loved so much, for whom she died. The year 1918, the Spanish flu, or that influenza virus, killed 72 out of 80 residents in a 5-day period, something truly devastating. Nevertheless, the mission continued with the help of many ordained and lay missionaries. Various preaching stations were established across the Seward Peninsula. Now, it's often said that a picture says 1,000 words. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll see these pictures come to life. I ran across a collection from the ELCA archives called the Helen Frost Collection. She was a lay missionary who served for many years in Alaska, and she took a lot of interesting photos. While I will describe what I see, you may want to just check the pictures out yourself. Helen Frost was born in 1896 in Iowa, the daughter of a Norwegian Lutheran pastor. She arrived in Nome in 1926, and she conducted mission work for the Inupiaq people for 35 years, over a period from 1926 to 1965, and she worked with what was then known as the Norwegian Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. During World War II, Frost was one of the few non-native Alaskans who stayed at the Tellerbrivig mission. She performed many functions. She had baptisms, confirmations, and marriages. She worked as a cook, a nurse. She was the postmaster, storekeeper, teacher, radio operator, marriage counselor, and choir and orchestra director. She took on a lot of responsibility, and some might say a lot of authority. It was unusual for the time, and even for today. She died at a rather old age in Carlsbad, California in 1986. During the 40s, maybe perhaps the 50s, she went on a tour through various Lutheran churches that she saw in Alaska, and these early color photos still stand out as showing wonderful aspects of the history of Lutheranism in Alaska. She took photos of the Brevig mission at Teller. She took a picture of various pastors and helpers standing outside a building with the name Lutheran Mission painted broadly on the outside. She has a photo of a woman named Bertha Stedja, and as it turns out, I ran into a Native Alaskan woman in Anchorage several years ago who remembered that she was named Bertha after this woman, the one who had baptized her. Many of the buildings at these missions were made out of wood, but others, especially during and after World War II, were made out of Quonset huts, a feature of the Alaskan frontier in early settlement days. They often had church group activities outside in the snow, as one photo from 1949 attests. Now, there is still no highway you can take to this part of Alaska on the Seward Peninsula. You'd often have to take a ship, or was more often in later days and still is today, you would fly. Although they were out in as much of a wilderness as you could possibly find in Alaska, the pastors and the people still dressed rather formally for everyday work and worship. There's a mission today at Shishmaref Island, which you can still see. In fact, this Lutheran congregation is still the center point of the congregation. In 1945, Anchorage started to see some more activity. Another church was built there. Fairbanks also saw churches being established. In Seward, the Old Methodist Church was purchased in 1945, although the Scandinavian immigrants began worshiping already in 1917, as they were visited by a pastor from Juneau. This former Methodist and now former Lutheran church in Seward is one of my favorite places to stop in Seward. It is today converted into a coffee shop, yet the original church architecture is still visible and is a feature of that structure. Now I'll tell you a little bit more about the history of Lutheranism in my area. Now, for those of you who have not been to Alaska or have not lived here, it is maybe hard to fathom that people who are still alive to this day can remember building their own log cabins by hand and living in them, clearing the land to raise a crop as homesteaders, people who were given, or at least offered at a very affordable price, free land from the government as long as they lived there for a certain period of time and established some kind of permanent residence there. This goes back to the 1862 Homesteaders Act signed by President Abraham Lincoln. It is how much of the western frontier was settled as grants for land were given to those who could live there and develop it. The last homesteads were in fact given out in Alaska during the middle of the 1900s, and that is how some of these communities were formed, and still, as they exist today, is based off the foundations of that homesteader period. The first Lutheran church in my area that was permanently established was in Soldotna. It was originally part of the ALC, now part of the ELCA. They had got a good location at a place called the Y, where the two main roads diverged. The families that formed that congregation first met in a hardware store in 1961. Logs and planks were their first pews used for worship. At first, pastors from Anchorage and Seward served these Lutheran families. The first structure was built in the form of the cross and erected in 1962. At this Y, at one of the most important intersections on the peninsula, the population grew from around 700 people in 1960 to 7,000 people by 1967, an amazing boom in growth. As one historian noted, Christ Church serves not suburbia America, but the growing edge, the last frontier with its homesteaders, oilmen, construction men, fishermen, and those who serve them. Christ Lutheran is the first ALC mission church in Alaska since its statehood. The historian also noted that, quote, about 95% of the community is housed in mobile homes, and a solid church is part of the answer to give permanency and security to people opening a new country to make it their home. The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod quickly followed. The year 1961, in the town of Kenai, not too far away, other families began meeting in Deering's general merchandise store, and then at the small town library. In 1967, the first resident pastor arrived, and a parsonage was completed in November. And on June 1st, 1969, the Star of the North Lutheran congregation dedicated their sanctuary, which still stands and is active to this day. In 1967, as I noted as the 100th anniversary of the purchase of Alaska from the United States, there were 24 established congregations representing 4 Lutheran bodies. As I noted, the Wisconsin Synod was not one of those bodies, yet the very next year, the Wisconsin Synod began its presence in Alaska. And this is not meant to be a detailed account of all the history of all the congregations in Alaska. I'll use several examples from this mission growth to illustrate what it looked like to establish Lutheranism in the last frontier in the early years and days of statehood. At this time, the late 60s, the Wisconsin Synod's home and inner missions were going through a bit of a reassessment and readjustment. For almost 100 years, the Wisconsin Synod had played a game, which I like to call Hungry, Hungry Hippos, for the millions of German Lutheran immigrants who were coming. Basically, although there was a lot of hard work establishing new congregations in new areas, there was a steady flow of new member potential from these immigrant groups. And over time, the Wisconsin Synod had established an attitude of letting the larger Missouri Synod do it. They had more people, more resources, and a broader geographic presence. If they were going to establish new congregations in new areas, might as well let their big sister handle the work. However, in 1960, after many years of difficulty, the Wisconsin Synod saw that it needed to break off its official fellowship with the Missouri Synod, and no longer could they look to them to be a co-worker in the harvest field. Nevertheless, despite this attitude of having the Missouri Synod do a lot of the work, the Wisconsin Synod did not hold off on establishing missions and congregations outside the Midwest. Already in 1917, a Pacific Northwest district was established after several years of mission work in the state of Washington. However, the Wisconsin Synod's first missionary journey to Alaska took place on October 31st, Reformation Day, in 1967, when 2 pastors flew to Anchorage and Fairbanks to meet with lay members of their synod who had already reached out to the synod's mission board. It was noted that establishing the church in the last frontier would be challenging, as one of the pastors noted, quote, because of the severe climate and rugged terrain, the high cost of living, the unfavorable employment situation, the loneliness of the long winters. Most people don't stay in Alaska very long. We have found that many of the names put on our list, the prospect list, during the last year had already moved. We do feel obligated to the people who belong to our synod here, but it'll probably take a good deal of study on the part of our mission boards before we can decide on how we can best serve them. According to one pastor, already after this exploratory visit, things really started to move. In December of 1967, a pastor named Dave Zietlow moved from his former call in Montana and was installed as the first pastor at Faith Lutheran Church in the city of Anchorage. According to most people who have run into this history, Pastor Zietlow can deservedly be called the father of the Wisconsin Synod in Alaska. On his own initiative, he had a hand in founding all 8 WELS congregations in Alaska, and he initiated a very unique practice that saw success of using vicars, which are third-year seminary students on a full interim year, as the man on the ground, at times many miles away from where he was at in Anchorage, to do the intense and personal ministry that he could not accomplish simply from visits made from Anchorage. One group of people who had been part of the Missouri Synod congregation in this area were rather pleased with their first 2 pastors, but one of the pastors turned out to be, according to one, quite liberal, and he had, quote, disenchanted many members with his unbiblical practices, end quote. Over time, several of these families left the Missouri Synod Church to worship on their own, according to their own consciences and their own interpretation of the Word of God. What took place was a group of Wisconsin Synod families, or at least those who are sympathetic to them, began gathering to worship in 1978, and Pastor Zietlow flew down from Faith in Anchorage to lead worship. He came on a twin-engine otter plane, and he continued to meet regularly with these families. He led the members of this Kenai Soldotna WELS group to see that evangelism was the heart of the church. His Easter message to them introduced a 4-word summary of the congregation's purpose. Come, see, go, tell. He said, quote, as you meditate on these commands, you will discover God's plan for reaching a lost world with the gospel. Here the message of salvation and the missionary challenge are beautifully combined. It is a believer's duty to run with the good news and tell others. Following a pattern that he had successfully employed already in Eagle River, Sitka, and South Anchorage, Pastor Zietlow thought that receiving an official exploratory mission status from the PNW, the Pacific Northwest District of the Synod, would be the next step in establishing a congregation in the Kenai area. However, his first attempts at acquiring this official exploratory mission status were unsuccessful. This left him a bit disappointed. Yet undeterred, Pastor Zietlow made a request of the Pacific Northwest District President for 1 or 2 vicars for this local group in Soldotna and Kenai. While the district president believed that a full-time mission developer would be the preferable option for Kenai Soldotna, the Synod at this time lacked the resources, and that made the use of a vicar the most pragmatic solution to this mission problem. Now, having a vicar who was not an ordained pastor, nor has he completed his studies, came along with some cons. He had a lack of experience. He was rather unprepared to start with a full workload right away in the beginning. And having a new vicar each year would only offer a lack of continuity for the local congregation. However, there were still some positives to having a vicar. A young guy who was eager to get out into the mission field after years of study would often be full of enthusiasm for the work and the task in front of him. He would come with fresh ideas and methods which are often needed to get a mission congregation off and running. And, as often as they were single with no other attachments, they had, quote, little else to do but work. And the first vicar who came to the Kenai Soldotna area for the Wisconsin Synod mission was Vicar Paul Ibish. In accordance with Zietlow's requests, he was assigned in May 1979 to this local congregation. In July, he arrived in Kenai and would be the congregation's first full-time worker. He would be supported by Pastor Zietlow, but at a distance. He would largely be on his own for day-to-day tasks. Zietlow's philosophy was this, quote, the more experience he has as a vicar, the better his future ministry will be. Now, this is part of the primary research I got to do for this project as I did the history of my own congregation. I got to hear from this vicar and others, and he gave me a wonderful little anecdote, which I'll share with you now. He said, quote, it was not my idea to go fishing in Kenai first. I had driven up the Alcan Highway and had been sleeping in my car. I wanted to get settled. But Pastor Zietlow kept a flatbed fishing boat at the marina on the Kenai. He is the one who insisted I sleep in my car another night and go fishing. He said I had to get my priorities straight. I caught about a 15-pound king salmon that day, but all I wanted to do was get started. The fishing thing was, quote, when in Alaska do as Alaskans do, unquote, and I would get pretty good at it before my 15 months were over. I could always have guaranteed fish. I would go fishing at 3 a.m., catch my limit by 5 a.m., and still have a full day of church work, end quote. He also shared, quote, there's also a long story about visiting prospects and needing them to come out and pull my car down their drive before it fell off the cliff the drive was built on. I came home rich in experience, but financially poorer. He noted that they did not have the vicar stipend adjusted for the increased cost of living in Alaska, and he often had to pay for his own flights. Now, Pastor Zietlow was primarily involved with the Faith Congregation in Anchorage, and that let Vicar Ibish learn by doing. He said, quote, we really didn't see all that much of each other. I would sleep over at their house the night before Sunday I would preach there. That was when Pastor Zietlow would review my biweekly sermon. He never commented on them. Pastor Zietlow had me type up the model constitution, which has served Grace. A note from Vicar Ibish to Pastor Zietlow shows how challenging and yet joyful ministry was at Grace's early months. In this letter, he said, quote, the attendance last Sunday wasn't real encouraging, but hopefully this Sunday will be better. I'm a little concerned that so-and-so haven't been coming lately, and I think I'll stop out to visit. Besides only having 12 in church, we also had no heat in the furnace at the church, as the furnace at the church was on the blink. Also, the ceiling in my apartment sprang a leak this week, and I am presently living in 2 apartments. If you'd like to come and visit, I now have an extra bed. He concluded, that is the condensed news from Kenai this week. Though I haven't stressed them here, joys have outweighed the concerns. The next vicar who served for roughly a year was the vicar Nathan Radke. He said, quote, I rather enjoyed those commuter flights to Anchorage every other Saturday and Sunday. Only once we were vertical, when we should have been horizontal. He also said, in the year I served Grace, the membership grew steadily, the ladies group was formed, the synod granted the first resident minister to Grace, and I returned to the seminary with a wonderful year full of vicar experiences. So they did receive their first full-time pastor in the year 1988, just 10 years after the first worship service. Grace had 83 souls. Already in April 1989, talks had begun about expanding the 2-year-old church structure, known as a WEF unit. This was a plan that the Wisconsin Synod had to grow missions quickly, to have a blueprint of a very small worship space that could easily be added to other additions being tacked on. And this WEF unit is still kind of the original heart of the larger campus we have today. On March 26th, in the year 2000, a new development took place at this congregation. Snow had to be cleared for a quote-unquote ground-breaking ceremony, though it was rather frosty at that time. In June, Builders for Christ, a group of volunteer workers within the Wisconsin Synod, came for 5 weeks to erect and close up a new sanctuary. And then, in April 2001, there was a new addition. The school was added to the congregation. In August 2001, Grace Lutheran School opened its doors with 21 students. This year, Grace Lutheran School has 95 students, a ministry that has been greatly expanded in the past 20 years. So perhaps it's bad preparation on my part, but I don't really have a conclusion. I've simply shared the story, a summary of Lutheranism in Alaska, showing various aspects of different groups of people who have been here for well over 150 years, serving the various congregations and populations in this great and large state with its many experiences and vastness, still left unfilled in many ways. If you're watching online, you can see some of the resources I compiled, including a map showing the location of current congregations, at least as of the year 2019, in Alaska and their preaching stations. I'll also show you briefly some of the resources and references that I used for this project. And with that, we're at the end of our presentation on the brief overview and summary of the history of Lutheranism in Alaska. Certainly didn't cover everyone or everything or every place. Alaska, after all, is a very large space. And personally, this was a wonderful place for myself and my family to live and to serve, not only serving with God's people, but also to be in a wonderful part where you can still see God's creation. If you'd like to visit Alaska someday, I certainly hope you get the chance. And while you'll certainly have a lot to look at, whether it be the nature aspects, which there's a great abundance of it, both on land and sea and in the air. Perhaps you'll be attracted to some history aspects like the Gold Rush era or World War II sites. And hopefully now you got a little bit of a feeling for where you can get some Lutheran history as well. Perhaps you go to Sitka and see the site of the first Lutheran congregation. Maybe you go to Seward and have some coffee in the halls of a place where Lutherans once gathered to worship. Maybe you'll make it all the way to Nome and visit a rather densely Lutheran populated area of the state. Whatever you do, I hope you enjoyed this podcast and you'll find some way to support us if you liked it. Whether you share this episode with someone who may find it interesting, you share it on social media, give us a wonderful review wherever you're listening to this podcast, or maybe you're watching it now on YouTube. If you really wanted to give us a little more support, we'd always appreciate that. On patreon.com, you can become one of our patrons. If you liked watching this in video form, consider joining one of those tiers where you can watch our other videos online. With that being said, we're at the end of our Season 3 of the Lutheran History Podcast. As I decided last summer, I'll be taking the summer off, but we already have an excellent episode lined up for us in September. We hope you all have a great time and always keep Lutheran history in the back of your mind.